how does consumerism generate wealth? The circulation or the movement or the flow of money ultimately generates what I call the magic trick, or that extra, that plus, that surplus, in Spanish known as excedente. And we're going to look at this from a philosophical point of view first. So, measuring defect and variation leads to irregularity, falsehood, invalid, socially, and illogical. So, what this means is that the potential, or that which can be, is not really able to be measured, right? Because it's potential. So if you say, I'm going to open up a business because I see there are needs and wants in this part of town for sports shoes or for running shoes or for this type of shampoo or this type of beauty product, that's tapping into that irregularity. Now, for science, that's something that is not true because it's non existent. For science and for, we could say, probabilistic statistics, what needs to happen is they need to see something regular, something consistent, and then we can say that that's true, which basically means it exists, it's real, it's valid, which validity in this case has to do with peer review, peer check, and ultimately social acceptance. So other people can confirm or can tell you that, yes, in fact, that which you're saying is true. And also, it can be labeled as correct. Correct in this case means logically sound, or mentally, it is something that is correct, right? It's logical. And the way to do this, very interestingly enough, because you can say, how do you achieve this? Well, you achieve this from past observations. You need to look at the past and you need to see what has been before, how many times it has been before, right? And ultimately, it leads to your memory, what you remember. This creates expectations, and then expectations is what leads you, or they conduce you to the future, in which now you can say, well, because I remember that things happen this way or that way, right? Then I can predict, I can expect for this to happen in the future. Expectations basically deal with probability, right? So statistically, because out of 10 times this has happened, or out of 10 situations, circumstances, this has happened 8 of those 10 times, or repeatedly 80 out of those 100 times, etc. On average, I can safely assume that if I do replicate this 10 times into the future or 100 times into the future, it will happen 8 or 80 times respectively, right? Probability plays a huge role in science, in hard fact science, right? In hard sciences, like physics, mathematics, chemistry, all of those types of sciences, right? Natural sciences that deal with nature and the workings of nature, while possibility and imagination do so in other areas, right? So this is interesting because you can say, well, what you're saying is possible, but it's unlikely. It's not probable, right? So based on my experience, based on the past, based on my expectations, right? Let's take money as an example now. This is where consumerism comes in. Exploit, what is money? Money and capital, more specifically, which is money as potential to make more money. Money plus money equals capital, right? It's the exploitation of symbolic potential, right? So you need to be able to represent for yourself what can be in order to multiply that money, right? In order for there to be more money, basically capital. And based basically what you're doing is you're basing this on what has happened before, using experience, right? Which are past events and probability. Without that, you would be unsure whether you could use your imagination, you could think of the possibilities and the potential. But if you don't have this other side of the coin, which is basing your observations on past experiences, how things have worked in the past, etc., then you don't have um, you could be wrong ultimately, right? Or there are more reasons to be right if you're able to basically think of all these other things, right? And you're able to add those past experiences, memories, observations, expectations into your equation, right? Into whatever you're doing. So I just heard right now, it's not about being right. It's not about getting it right. It's about not getting it wrong, which I think is very interesting because this points to not thinking about how to get it right, but thinking about the ways in which it could go wrong and defending and guarding, safeguarding or or basically putting in safeguards against those things, right? Anticipating the possible problems because just like there could be potential for benefit for personal gain, there could also be potential for personal demise, right? Um, so symbols like money permit interpretation essentially, and the flow of money, consumerism, and movement generates wealth, the extra and surplus, and activates needs and wants. So we can talk about needs and wants that we didn't even know we had. For example, consuming information such as the news, the newspaper. We know that that was a campaign. There was a campaign in the late 1800s with Pulitzer and Randolph, right? William Randolph Hearst, where they created basically the need and this idea that you need to be informed. You're not ignorant. You're a well educated and informed citizen if you consume the news, right? Totally made up, totally symbolic. Smoking cigarettes, the consumption of alcohol, like I mentioned, the French paradox, this idea that drinking a cup or a glass of wine a day is good for your health. That's a myth. It's completely based on observation and mere heuristic. So it's not true, scientifically proven, health proven also. So money we know as a symbol, right? And this interpretation of what it means and what it can mean and what I can do, right? Tapping into all of that potential ultimately is what leads to growth, right? So we can talk about there actually being not just like essentially a universe or a reality which is, but which can be, right? And that dynamic of what can be is so interesting because that's where that magic trick that I was talking about is. That's where that extra comes in, right? Like how do you make something out of nothing? How do you make a house appear where there wasn't a house before, right? With opportunities, with potential, with probability, with possibility, ultimately, which is using your imagination. Now, what does all this mean? What does all this mean for your life? Well, it means that you can ultimately change your life, like we've seen 1,000 times through self-help elements, through self-help notions. Um, but it also means that you are a potential creator, such as Steve Jobs mentioned. And this can ultimately benefit your life and other people's lives because basically you're able to achieve and get what you want, which again leads to a materialistic capitalist mentality. Unfortunately, it is the one in which we live in, and it should be the aim for everybody, at least up until now.